Hey everybody, this is Kai Wehner from Confluent. Today I will talk about an exciting topic, streaming machine learning with Kafka and Confluent in pharma and life science. I see a lot of use cases in these industries these days at our customers, and therefore I thought I make this video. I will cover a few different use cases and what you can do, but in general in pharma and life science, you really see event streaming everywhere. This might be in engineering, in sales and marketing, manufacturing, supply chain, or in after sales. And therefore here you see just a few examples. The point is that you always need to process a lot of data, and in most cases it's good if you process data at scale in real time. And therefore I won't cover all these use cases in detail, but the point is more about that you need still to focus on your business value, of course. And starting from that, if you see these examples from pharma and life sciences, like connected health or something like healthcare workers and how they work in their industry, or something like cybersecurity threats, then it's always important to start with the business case and then drill down into what you want to do to implement this. And this is then where specific pieces come out from the architecture and specific use cases. And then you implement this with the data engineering and infrastructure technologies like Kafka for doing the clickstream analytics or building data pipelines, building a microservice architecture, continuously process the data, or store it in another database for further analytics. This is commonly how you have to think about this and then find out which technology is the right one for which part of the problem. So before we start with the more technical discussion, here's a few examples from Confluent customers doing stream processing and data processing at scale with Kafka and Confluent. InVT is the first example. It's one of several customers which use Kafka for genetic data processing. So in their case, they want to get it more into mainstream medical practice. And the interesting part of this customer here is that they really focused on data science. So this is typically not the Java developer, but more like Python persons. And they still needed to deploy this infrastructure 24/7 for production at scale. This is not really what Python is, right? And that's how you can combine this data science ecosystem with Kafka. So it's a great use case. And by the way, all of these use cases you see have some links. So they, for example, talked at a Kafka summit where you can take a look at the slides and video recordings of all these examples I show to get more details about that. The second example is Babylon Health. So they are in the end working to make the health services more accessible and affordable by everybody with their mobile app. And for that, they had a lot of issues to solve, like connectivity to many different technologies, both on the consumer side, but also in the back end. And they also have to be GDPR and PII compliant, of course, like many customers in healthcare business and life sciences and so on. And therefore they have built an agile microservice architecture to integrate with many different data sources and things and process data at scale. The next example is Bayer AG. In this case, it's formerly called Monsanto, which was acquired by Bayer a few years ago. But the most interesting part here is that it is a very common scenario because it's about hybrid architectures. A lot of the data is still on-premise, but the new strategy is to process data in the cloud. And therefore, Bayer had to build a hybrid real-time replication at scale from different data centers to the cloud and back. And then also we're seeing more and more multi-cloud architectures here. And therefore, they leverage Kafka and Confluent to replicate the data reliably between the different locations and also process the data where it is relevant, sometimes in the data center and sometimes in the cloud. And the last example is Cellmatics. Cellmatics is also building several digital tools to get genetic insights, and it's pretty interesting because for them, of course, they also need to integrate heterogeneous data. So they have many different data sources and data things. And in their case, governance and security was one of the biggest points to think about. And that's what they have also implemented around an event streaming platform to do it in real time at scale. So what all of these examples have in common is that they all have to integrate with different data sources and things and need to scale and process data where possible in real time. But still, of course, they combine this with different other technologies. So it's totally fine to complement all this, right? And therefore, event streaming and machine learning, in the example of this talk here, is really important in so many different use cases in pharma and life science, where you get the data out of all the different systems. Some is real-time streaming data, some others is more like file-based or batch or integration with legacy systems. And you integrate and correlate these information systems and send the output to other systems, which can be another real-time consumer, or it can be a data store in the cloud for further analytics, or your ERP system, like in this case SAP. So this is how all these customers use event streaming more and more in the middle, to be scalable and reliable, but still be able to process the data in real time where needed. In this talk today, I want to focus on one specific use case, which is drug discovery. This is pretty interesting because drug discovery typically takes 10 years or longer. So as you can imagine, you can do some things faster. And part of the process is that data processing took a lot of time in the past. And therefore, here I also focus on one more example where Kafka is used a lot. This is Recursion Pharmaceutical, which is one company which has built a massively parallel system to combine experimental biology, AI, automation, and real-time event streaming to accelerate drug discovery. And of course, this is also a complex process, and the data processing is just part of the overall process, why it takes 10 years, of course. But data processing in real time is a big part of that. And one example of this is, as you can see in this picture, is image processing. So you have to analyze pictures and find out of the cells which you see, is it, in this case, a healthy child or a child with a rare genetic disease, for example. So as part of the process, you take a look at pictures by machines and analyze them to find out insights about that. And this is really the part which I will cover, just to give you one example in more detail. And therefore, if you have no idea what image and video processing is, so this exists for a long time and a lot of APIs are there. In the meantime, more and more projects use deep learning for that, because with that it's getting very powerful, where machines often get even better in image recognition than humans do. And therefore you can process the images better than before. But on a low level, in the end, images, it's just pixels, right? It's zeros and ones. And that's also how all these APIs work to analyze and process data. And the same then is true for video processing. A video is just a sequence of different images. And so a sequence of many zeros and ones. And in the example of Recursion, which I will cover on in more detail, they in the beginning started on their laptop. So they had drug discovery and it was very manual and slow. And they put the data for processing bursty batch mode. It wasn't really scalable. So they took some Python scripts which they had on their laptop and run it. And then they stored everything in an object store in AWS S3 in their case to do some further processing. So this might be good for the first example, but then for the real processing at scale with different labs, this is not how you should do it. And therefore, this is not how Recursion did it. So they re-engineered their architecture to be more scalable and not dependent of the laptops of the workers. So what they do is still a combination of on-premise processing, where they make the picture in the labs, but then process the data in real time and finally store it in the cloud, in Google Cloud Services, to use tools like BigQuery, for example. But all the data integration and data processing is happening with the Kafka ecosystem. So they, for example, use Dagger, which is a Kafka Streams processing engine for doing orchestration of all these jobs they do. And we will see this in more detail, but that's in the end the main idea I talk about today. So that you can do scalable real-time data processing to improve your processes from the manual and batch and laptop-based deployments. And now, if we think about this example from Recursion in a more generic way, this is how a common architecture looks like for event streaming. Let's take a look at this from the left side. So we have in this case the labs where you get some pictures out of the data and out of the tools to create the pictures. and you ingest this information. It depends. Sometimes it's really pictures, sometimes it's just the metadata. I will cover that later in this talk. But you ingest some data in real time into the streaming platform to process the data. That's what you see at the top. And this can be some traditional data processing like filtering, or this can be image processing, for example, for noise reduction. And here you could either use traditional APIs or you can use deep learning for that. It doesn't matter what exact algorithm and technology you use in these pipelines. And you can even improve these over time. So after you've processed data, then you ingest it into other systems like you see on the right side. Either in some automated drug analysis where you process data continuously and take a look at that. And also in parallel, another consumer might be a batch reporting platform where you create some dashboards to analyze. And this is, of course, only the very high-level description of such a drug discovery process. But what's important, then also you need some kind of workflow orchestration. And that's what Recursion in their case did with a Kafka Streams API called Dagger. So this is really just to give you a high-level idea about how such an architecture could look like. In our case, if we take a look at one of these examples, then we think about digital image processing for drug discovery. So this is part of the picture where you have to process all the metadata and also process the pictures itself to learn about the features of the images. And with that, you can, for example, use machine learning to train models to decide between healthy cells and disease cells with problematic genes. So this is in the end how you want to do that, to apply this logic then to different drugs and make disease cells look healthy again. This is more or less then, on a very high level again, what the drug development process looks like. So as this talk is about Kafka and machine learning and how this can help you, let's think about that again. And this is really also true for the examples I showed before from different customers. On the one side, you always have the data scientists. They leverage Python and their favorite ML framework or algorithms to build some algorithms or models. But the big question then is, how do you deploy this to production at scale? This is where many customers then really have challenges, because the Python script which you build in your Jupyter notebook on a laptop, this is not really there for reliable processing. Like if you want to create a lot of pictures in all these labs and then process it continuously in a reliable way 24/7. And that's actually then where you need some help. Because this is really the hidden technical debt in machine learning systems. And I'm not sure if you've seen this before. This is a paper from Google. And it shows the different challenges and tasks you have to solve when you want to bring ML in production. And the funny part is that ML code, the Python scripts you write or data scientists write on his laptop, this is really just a small fraction of the overall architecture. It's much more challenging to do all the data collection and data processing and then training the model, serving the infrastructure for model scoring, doing the monitoring of the whole ecosystem. So there's a lot of things to do here. And again, it has to run at scale, reliably 24/7 in real time. And let's now first take a look at a few other examples where they solve these challenges. The first one is Netflix. This is really data processing at scale in real time. In this example, they have built a recommendation engine to show the right information to the right user at the right time, because they want you to watch more and more instead of going to Amazon Prime or the traditional TV. And therefore, they have built and deployed analytic models in real time to do that for millions of users. Uber is another example where they need to process data at real time and scale all the time. They have to correlate the data from the drivers, from the customers who order the taxis, to calculate things like estimated time of arrival and expected cost for the ride, and many other things. And this has to run for millions of users in real time at scale. And you can imagine if this is down for an hour, Uber is in trouble. And the last example is PayPal. They have built a huge framework for fraud detection where they have to process a lot of events and build a lot of different models at scale, because if fraud detection is down for an hour, then you also got into trouble. And these examples are great because they show you how to do it, and they talk a lot more about that in their blogs and videos, as you can see in the links. And the interesting part is that they all use Kafka for that. For good reasons, right? Need to be mission critical, real time, at scale. That's what Kafka can help you with. And as you can see here again with Kafka, and I don't go into detail here, we have so many other talks where Kafka is introduced, but the point is it's not just for real-time messaging at scale, but it's also decoupling the different producers and consumers, because Kafka is also a storage system. It's not just a messaging system. And this combination of messaging and storage makes it so powerful. And then the frameworks Kafka Connect for integration and Kafka Streams for continuous processing of the data, or called stream processing or streaming analytics. This is all inbuilt in Kafka, and that makes it so powerful for these use cases. To use just one solution for solving all these different challenges. And you can then use this to deploy your infrastructures at scale. So this is just a few examples here from the tech companies. But as you can imagine or hopefully know already, Kafka is used everywhere in the meantime. So probably almost every global Fortune 2000 companies using Kafka in different projects. And also important, Kafka is not just used for big data. That's what I mention all the time. So if you have seen some of my videos, I mention this all the time because people are not aware of this. Kafka is used more and more also for critical data, for business transactions. This is typically not the terabytes of data like if you want to process images, but it's more about the payment or the critical information in the hospital when someone is analyzing the real-time data of the patient, for example. And now let's map this to the machine learning part. So for example, again, for drug discovery, for image processing, for metadata processing, to apply analytic models to make better calculations or decisions. And if you think about machine learning, it's in two parts. It's model training and it's model scoring for doing predictions. Model training is done by ingesting all the data into a data store to train a model on that. And you see that from the flow from all the data sources via Kafka and with some processing and integration into a data store to do model training there. And on the other side then, you want to do scoring, as you see in the bottom left, with the same data of new events, right? But you want to apply the model to do predictions on that. For example, to analyze an image. First, you ingest all the image information or metadata or the images itself and use it for model training to find insights and correlations. And then you use this on new images. For example, to detect cancer, or it can help you with drug discovery, as we have seen before. And obviously, it's not just Kafka for messaging, as I said before, but it's really the ecosystem, like using Kafka Connect for integration with the sinks and sources, or using a schema registry to have governance and to enforce that all the producers and consumers speak the same language. Or you can, for example, use the Python client, as you see on the bottom right, to do the model training so that the data scientist can use its favorite Python libraries like NumPy or scikit-learn and do all of that with rapid prototyping in a Jupyter notebook. While on the left side, when you deploy this model, this might be a Kafka Streams Java application because this has to run 24/7 at scale in a reliable way. It's all up to you, right? So this is just examples. And therefore, let's take a look again at this drug discovery example for image processing. In this case, we have the labs, which are often Windows machines, right? So you need something like .NET or C++ to integrate. And then we can send the images to the Confluent server, where then you do some more processing of the data, like filtering, like aggregating, calculating the metadata, or doing other processing. Often this is combined with other information. So it's not just about the new images from the labs on the Windows machines, but you also ingest data from other systems like a database. For example, with Kafka Connect, with Change Data Capture, you can even push new changes of the database also into the streaming platform. There's many options here. This is just one example. So that in this case, we then do digital image processing by using all the data and then also applying, for example, an analytic model for that. This could be either hosted into the Kafka application, Or maybe it can be an external service where you send this information to do the processing, and then you get the result back. So if you already have an image processing infrastructure, you can still use that. You don't need to re-implement things with Kafka. Or, like I said in this case, you can of course also deploy a model into a Kafka application. Right? There's many different options what you want to do. And then of course in parallel to do some kind of real-time scoring and data processing with Kafka, you can also ingest it into other systems like Hadoop to run Spark on that for some more MapReduce, or maybe to connect to a BI tool like Tableau or Qlik. So this architecture is very flexible, and that's part of this advantage. So you can connect different systems all the time and also change and improve the process with different systems over time and connect more and more systems. This is the beauty of Kafka because it decouples everything, as I said, because it's not just a messaging system, but also a storage system to decouple everything. No matter, one is real-time, one is batched, and the third one is request response. This works much better with Kafka than with other systems because all these things are built in to be supported. And of course, then you also often in these kind of use cases need some kind of workflow orchestration. This is another thing which could be done just with a Kafka application, or you can also use again an external service for that. If we think about these steps in a few more details, here's what you have to do. First, you get the data from the labs into Kafka, often with Kafka Connect, as we have just seen. Or sometimes you have an edge cluster, like in your labs, where you do some local processing, and from here you replicate the data into the Kafka cluster for further analytics. And then when you want to do machine learning with Kafka, then typically you have to pre-process the data. That's where data scientists spend most of their time. And this is some more data-related stuff like filtering or transformations, or sometimes some more ML-specific stuff like feature extraction, or in case of images, it's more like picture-specific stuff like noise reduction or enhancing brightness and contrast. And here different tools can be used. So some of this can be Kafka native, and for some others you use another API, like for image processing. The advantage if you use Kafka technologies for that is that this also works at scale in real time. So you always should question yourself, should I really use this other external system where I send the data to for processing, or do I want to do it right into Kafka? You can also embed other APIs into a Kafka application, like for image processing or for machine learning and deep learning for images. All these things can be handled externally in its own system or database, or you can do it Kafka natively. Here's one example for data processing with ksqL. The point here is really that you see that you can solve this impedance mismatch between the data scientist, who uses Python and Jupyter for rapid prototyping, but then you can also deploy this single query into a production server. So what you see here for doing some metadata processing of the images in this case, this query can be deployed to process millions of events at scale in real time. Because under the hood, it's just Kafka. And that's the beauty to combine and connect the data scientists with the production engineers. Or sometimes the data scientist is the production engineer who really deploys this to production. And that's pretty straightforward here because you can still just use Python and ksqL queries and no Java or something like that at all. In this case, we talk about image recognition. So if you want to use a fancy deep learning technology, you can use convolutional neural networks, which are used to do image recognition, right? They are analyzing all the features. Again, remember, it's just pixels, it's just ones and O's in the end. Under the hood, it's very complex and a lot of computation power with CPUs and memory is used to make the right decision. And this is, as we've seen before, also for drug discovery to make these kind of helpful decisions. So for model training then, we consume these events which happened before, and the event can be any metadata information, or this can be pictures. And then we train models on that, for example, in this case with TensorFlow. Here actually we directly consume the data from the Kafka log. So this means you don't even need another data lake anymore, like an S3 object store or HDFS for Hadoop. You can also consume the data directly from Kafka into your ML framework to train the models, like as you see here with the TensorFlow IO and Kafka plugin. This is, of course, again, just one option. You can still also just use Kafka for processing and ingestion into a data store and train your models, for example, with Spark ML or Google Cloud Services on top of the Google Cloud storage. So after this explanation, people then often ask, well, how long should I store the data in Kafka then? And this really depends on what you use it for. So what's important to understand, in Kafka, typically people store data only for a few hours or a few days because it got very expensive and scalability was much harder than in a real data lake. This actually changed in the meantime, where Confluent has implemented a tiered storage for Kafka. Because with this, under the hood, most of the data is also stored in an object store. So the same thing what you do for your data lake like Hadoop can be done for a Kafka. So you store most of the data in AWS S3, for example. And with this, you decouple the processing from the storage, which makes it much, much cheaper also for big data, and also makes scalability much better for elastically scale up a Kafka cluster or scaling it down, depending on how much you need for that. So, and this again is just a little bit of an explanation that you can also store data in Kafka much longer. And for some use cases, people store data in Kafka forever. And there's good reasons for that. So if you think about your next data architecture, it can be really simplified if you use Kafka as your event-based data store for a longer time, because you don't need this other system anymore. And because Kafka has the great advantage of being event-based with guaranteed order, and it's preserving the offset, so you really can reprocess the data and consume it again from where you stopped before, or simply consume the data from scratch again, or just for a specific time frame. And so instead of having two data stores in the end, you can have just one with the simplified architecture. And then some people also use the object store for their backup, because AWS S3, for example, I think they give, 10 nines of availability or something like this. So that's pretty good. And with Kafka using tiered storage under the hood, it's exactly the same like you would use with any other data lake. And again, so the big idea here is not to have Kafka as your only data lake, but the big advantage of you storing your data long-term in Kafka is that you can reuse these events. For example, if a new consumer is started. Especially in these examples, which we have seen a bit with all the labs, where you want to process images and the metadata again and again. Here it is, still event-based. You can consume it again. Or if something didn't work well for error handling because maybe your processing script was configured wrongly. Perfect example for reprocessing the data again from the Kafka log. Sometimes it's also for compliance and regulatory. So I've talked to several pharma customers where they have to store this logic for many years anyway. So why not just turn on the tiered storage and store it event-based in Kafka then in your favorite object store? And of course, then you can also reconsume and query the data. So in Kafka, it's pretty straightforward to also consume just some of the data. Like, let's say, give me all the images back from December 2018 and consume them for pre-processing. So this is pretty straightforward. And then you can also connect tools like Rockset, where you really have an ANSI SQL layer on top of Kafka, for example, for tools like Tableau or Qlik. With that having said, I always really want to point out, so the goal is not to replace any other database with Kafka. It's just what you can do with it, but it does not mean that you don't need Oracle and MongoDB and all these other databases anymore. Of course you do. Another great example is model training, because you can consume the events again and again and train different models on the events. As you have seen before, of course you can also store it in a data lake and consume and process it there. But as you have seen with TensorFlow IO and Kafka plugin, you can also directly consume the data from Kafka for model training. I've written a more detailed blog about this idea about streaming machine learning just with Kafka and tiered storage without using another data lake like an object store or Hadoop. What's also important, and I really want to highlight that again, is this separation of concerns. So model training and model inference can happen in the same place, but they don't have to. And more customers I see are separating this because they build one pipeline for model training, like maybe something like Spark on a big data lake. But then the model deployment is used somewhere else, maybe in the labs, directly on the computers, right? On the Windows servers, for example. So this is very easy to separate because a model is just a binary. So you can train it in your big data set and then you deploy it somewhere else to process new events in real time at scale. For model deployment, there's two different options. I will not go into deep dive here. I have a Kafka Summit talk talking about this for 60 minutes with all the details. But in the end, when you have a Kafka application like you see on the left side, then you can also, of course, communicate with a model server where you train your model and deploy it. The big advantage of that is that the model serving works like you know it. The big drawback is that you always have this RPC call between the model server and between the streaming application. And this is actually an anti-pattern. So this is good for some use cases, but the more robust and the more scalable you have to be, the more I recommend that you deploy your model directly into the streaming application. This is actually pretty straightforward because a model is just a binary. No matter which ML technology you use. This can then be a Python code, this can be something like protobuf in case of TensorFlow, this can be Java code generated by H2O, or maybe it's some proprietary model, but there's typically always APIs so that you can directly embed it into the streaming application. And the streaming application don't have to be Java files, right? Like Kafka streams. This can also be like in the lab, on the Windows server, be a .NET application with a C or C++ Kafka client. Here's an example where I used ksqL to do model scoring. So the model was trained somewhere, but then we want to do model scoring, in this case for image processing and detection. And here you see, this is a very simple SQL query. And under the hood, in this case, you can either use a TensorFlow model or even just use an image processing API like OpenCV. So this is not ML at all. This is a very mature image processing API for metadata processing and so on of images. And you can easily embed this, in this case in a ksqL query, so that the end user can use it without knowing what's happening under the hood. So you can implement such a user-defined function once and then use it everywhere. And this makes it pretty powerful, but still the point here is, again, it's scalable in real time because under the hood, this is just Kafka. And that's really beautiful, I think. So now, if you think about this again, model training and scoring with the same ML pipeline, that's really also a big part of the story. Because I've seen many customers which have built one pipeline for model training. This is what a data scientist does in Python, for example. And then, because you need to deploy a reliable system for production, better scalability, better SLAs, they have built another pipeline. So that doesn't really make sense. So we see more and more customers which really build one pipeline, which they use for model training and for model scoring. And that's not that hard, at least for many parts of that. Even if you can reuse 80 or even just 50% of the pipeline for both cases, for training and or for scoring, that's still a big win for your organization. And again, no worries, you can still use your favorite tools. Like the data scientist can use pandas and scikit-learn together with other tools. And on the other side, you can deploy to production. And you can even deploy to production just with a Python client. I've seen customers doing that. So the data scientist builds the model processing and builds the models and deploys that into a Docker container and runs it. For example, on Kubernetes, where you can even scale it up like crazy for more processing. And still the data scientist can support the code and the deployment because it's just Python code. And again, this is just one of the options so that you get an understanding about what's possible. I want to talk now a little bit more about image and video processing with Kafka, because this is a question which comes up all the time. On the top left, you see one of these workflows from Recursion about their drug discovery, which they speed up with Kafka streams. So of course, this is many different steps you have to do. And some of these steps require image processing, either processing the images themselves or only the metadata of the images. And therefore, the question which always comes up is, should I process big files with Kafka, like images or videos, right? This can be megabytes or even gigabytes of data. And the answer really depends. And therefore, on the right side, I've linked to a few examples of other companies discussing this, like LinkedIn has a great discussion about that. And so, in short, you can either process big data sets directly with Kafka, that's definitely possible, and even with files which are 10 or 100 megabyte. But on the other side, it's not always ideal. So therefore, you can also do what LinkedIn here called reference-based messaging, which means that Kafka as orchestration layer and eventing layer is just using the link to the image or video. And the image or video itself is directly transferred, for example, from a Windows server to an S3 store with another managed file transfer tool, for example. So there is all these different options you have. Either natively process the data with Kafka. So this can be done also for bigger files, right? And I've also seen examples where people used Kafka for video processing. Like there's a great burglar example on the web where someone uses TensorFlow. And so the camera is doing real-time tracking of the people in front of the house. And then these images are sent via Kafka to some server. And there the video processing is happening. And if these images or videos are too big, you can also easily chunk and reassemble them. That's also what LinkedIn is talking about, how they do it. So you can split up a 1 gigabyte image into maybe 110 megabyte files and send them via Kafka. Or on the end, you just send the metadata via Kafka and use a managed file transfer to process the videos somehow. It's really all these trade-offs. It has pros and cons. It's about SLAs. It's about how many different systems to manage. It's about how many images and videos we have to process. And then you can really decide by yourself and evaluate what makes the most sense for me. And the other part I talked about a lot, but not in detail, was workflow orchestration. Especially in these pharma and life science use cases like drug development. This is a big part of the story. Like you see on the left side, where there is a workflow from Recursion for their drug discovery. And here, again, you have different options for that. In the case of Recursion, they use Dagger, which is a very lightweight orchestration engine implemented natively on Kafka streams to do this. So if you have especially automated processes and just have one step after the next and so on, then something like Kafka native processing has a lot of advantages because it's scalable, it's real-time, it's no other system needed, and you can keep state in there, right? It's not just stateless processing. So then it totally makes sense. Another example for this is Swisscom. They have built an orchestration engine also on Kafka streams to keep the state in one of these Kafka streams applications. And from that, then they control all the other processes they have. And so this is a stateful workflow engine, which they have built on Kafka streams. On the other side, building a workflow orchestration engine on Kafka is not always perfect. So sometimes you should really use an external tool. And this might be a BPM engine, which there's plenty on the market. Or this is maybe something like a more modern workflow orchestration tool, like you see here with CB, which is one open source example, in this case by Camunda. This is really built more for scale and also similar to Kafka and also has good Kafka connectivity via a Kafka Connect connector. The huge benefit here is that this can also be integrated with human interaction. So that's built in there, right? They use BPMN, the standard BPM tool for that. But also they can do processing at scale. And therefore, this might be an option. Therefore, again, there is no best option here. Really has trade-offs regarding SLAs, complexity, how many systems you use. Therefore, evaluate all these options and then make your decision. Yeah, with that, if we recap, so we have seen a few different examples of how you can process data with Kafka in real time at scale. And the example I focused on, it was about drug discovery and specifically about the image processing parts. And again, you can pick and choose what you need here. That's, I think, the most important part here. The core is event streaming and scalable and real time, but you can also integrate, for example, with a Windows server where you just create some new files which you push to Kafka. And then you can do either use just some APIs like OpenCV, which you could integrate into a Kafka application, or maybe use your external servers. Or you can use cutting-edge machine learning and image recognition in this example. And also you can combine the images with other data, like from a database, and correlate it. And as I also just discussed, you can do workflow orchestration, and you can do whatever you want here in the end, right? The architecture is very flexible, but important. The core is real-time and scalable and open. And so you can integrate with modern new streaming interfaces, but also with legacy stuff like files, or we have many customers also in Pharma, for example, which need to integrate with mainframe systems. So this is definitely also part of the story here. And on the other side, you can use cutting-edge technologies for machine learning, for analytics, and for deployment in the cloud of mission-critical applications. I have several examples about Kafka and machine learning in my GitHub repo. Some are very simple with Kafka streams or with ksqL, and a few are also more sophisticated, like we've built really an infrastructure where we connect to 100,000 clients and process this data in real time for model training. And I also have one example for the data scientist where I really use these technologies with Python and Jupyter notebooks, so that you can see how you can even combine this with your favorite tools like scikit-learn or NumPy. Yeah, in summary, there's really a huge opportunity in pharma and life science, and event streaming can help a lot to use the data better. Even if it could be either just an integration pipeline which you build with Kafka for real-time integration and processing at scale, or it can really be to build new business applications around Kafka. And really with drug development, we've seen just one example where this can help. But we see customers, for example, doing it in supply chain. We see it in after sales. We see it in R&D. We really see it in many different use cases. So no matter which business unit you're in, I think an event streaming platform should be considered to how it can be helpful. So I hope this was really helpful. So the key takeaways are for Kafka and machine learning, don't underestimate the hidden technical depths in these machine learning systems. It's really not just about building the models, but about how to deploy all this infrastructure. And this is where really Confluent can help a lot with all its ecosystem about building a flexible event streaming platform. And as you have seen, there's a lot of cutting edge technologies which you could use. You don't have to. But things like tiered storage for storing data in Kafka longer and decouple it from the processing. Or, for example, integration between TensorFlow and Kafka without another data link in the middle could really simplify your big data architecture. And this is all just options, right? You're very flexible of how to do that. And I think that, in summary, is really one of the big advantages of Kafka. To have an open, flexible ecosystem, but still be able to integrate with everything, modern and legacy. So one last thing, I didn't specifically talk about this, but of course legacy integration is big for pharma and life sciences. I have a lot of other material about that, so I won't cover it here in detail. Just check this out, how you can integrate between Kafka and legacy systems like mainframes or other existing batch ETL systems. This is not a big bang replacement typically, but these are complementary to each other. So you really need to understand how this works in much more detail. And therefore, this is, I think, my last slide. It's really, the point is you can really use this kind of strangler design pattern where you can integrate legacy systems with new applications, and where it makes sense, you can replace existing systems over time. But this is not always needed, of course. And so really it's about what do you need and how do you implement it. Just check out this material to understand more about how Kafka and Confluent is specifically used for legacy integration like mainframes and old batch pipelines and so on. So I hope this was a good overview about how you can leverage event streaming and machine learning in pharma and life sciences. And I hope you have a few ideas now. So please let me know your feedback, and also just share with me your questions and connect on LinkedIn and so on. I'm happy to answer